Hello all, I'm Dr. Gangaji Kamath, the consultant ENT head and neck and skull base surgeon under World Skull Base Foundation and Bangalore Skull Base Institute, Bangalore, India. And today we're going to talk about mucormycosis. Yes, it's a need of an hour topic, and we're going to try to understand why mucormycosis is raising as an epidemic within a pandemic. So many Indians are affecting very rapidly and are getting succumbed to this disease apart from the COVID-19. And we are here to discuss about what is mucormycosis, why it is an epidemic, and what are the characteristics of this disease, and what are the available treatment options. Is it really curable? And
Thank you, Ganga. We are here to discuss, as Ganga was saying, mucormycosis, which is today what I call a epidemic within a pandemic. It's uh, it's tragic to say the least because we've hit close to 10,000 cases in a span of just about 3 or 4 months, and that's something much beyond an epidemic, and it's I would say an epidemic of tragic proportions. So let's quickly go through the first part of the presentation, which is to discuss what is mucormycosis, what are the risk factors, what is the state of mucormycosis in India, and what is its pathogenesis. The second phase, which I would say is a little more interesting for me, is for us to discuss what is the source of this infection and is there any factor that is responsible for the growth of or the surge in the number of mucor cases in the last few months, over and above the patient factors, that is COVID, diabetes, etc. So mucormycosis is caused by a set of fungus called Mucormycetes, which are found in the environment and they release spores. And these are ubiquitous organisms which are found everywhere. This hyphae grow over surfaces. The filamentous forms are the more, I would say, invasive infiltrative forms, and the spores are obviously shed into the air and they are propagated through the air. The most common genera that cause mucormycosis are Rhizopus and Mucor itself. So they're caused by inhalation of spores, which causes the more devastating RCOM, that is rhinocerebro-ocular mucor. There could be cutaneous infections that are caused due to direct infiltration of the fungus into the skin. Contaminated food can cause what is called gastrointestinal mucor. Now, mucormycosis is a very rare infection. Let's keep that in mind right in the beginning. The more commoner infections are Candida and Aspergillus. And if you look at the fungal outbreaks that have happened over the last 30-40 years, you will see that most of them are Aspergillus fungal outbreak or Candida, and mucus rarely figures in the list of the top fungal, I would say, microbial organism, causative organism. The bad news and the worst part of mucor is that it is a very dangerous organism in terms of resistance to antifungal agents and to surgery itself, and the mortality is between 50 to 80% reported in literature. Now, what are the risk factors of mucor? Why does it come in the first place? The most important cause for mucormycetes and flare-up of mucor in subjects or human beings is immunosuppression. Now, if you look at the data between the West and India, the Western data clearly suggests towards mucor being a causative organism or a opportunistic fungal organism in transplant patients, in hematologic malignancies, and in cancer patients who undergo long-term steroid treatment. However, in India, diabetes is one of the most important underlying factors seen in mucor patients. Mucormycetes grow best in acidic, high glucose environment that is seen in diabetes mellitus, and it is complicated with what is called diabetic ketoacidosis. Diabetic ketoacidosis, for the layman, is a situation where the blood turns acidic due to very, very high sugar levels, much higher than 400, 500 levels of glucose. mucor in India is about 50 to 60 times higher than in the Western literature. Let's begin from that point. So in India, you see a lot more mucor than in several other countries, attributable primarily to the fact that diabetes is very prevalent in India, and India is called, in fact, the diabetes capital of the world. The maximum number of diabetic patients anywhere in the world are in India, and if you see this picture, you'll see that the diabetic belt, so to say, is in the Indian subcontinent and around the Middle East, Eastern countries. The annual incidence of mucor has always grown in India, beginning from about 13 cases in the 90s to about 50 cases in the 2000s. In a multicentric study that was done, taking into account 12 centers over a period of about 2 years, and 465 cases were documented, the annual incidence comes up to about 20 cases per year. I would say that in the past we were seeing less than 150 cases, I would say, at the maximum in a year. Now 3 to 26% of all those mucor cases were actually seen in immunocompetent hosts. The other factors for mucor have reported in Indian literature have been chronic kidney disease, pulmonary tuberculosis, chronic obstructive pulmonary disease, and several such other factors. Coming into the pathogenesis of mucor. How does mucor, which is a otherwise ubiquitous fungi which is there everywhere around us and generally doesn't infect human beings, how has it happened to lead to a pandemic like this? What is going wrong? We need to understand that the first line of defense against mucor is in the aerodigestive tract, in the mucosa of the nose, throat, lungs, and in the digestive system. So there are what are called mononuclear and polymorphonuclear phagocytes. So these cells in the lining of the mucosa eat up the fungi in the first place. Most of the fungi are presented as spores. So the spores are the manifestation of fungi in the air, and all these are inhaled, and in the normal immunocompetent individual, healthy individual, these are all killed by phagocytes, and they are the most important defense mechanism against mucormycosis. Now what happens in diabetics? In a hyperglycemic status, if you see this picture, the left half of the picture shows how a phagocyte is eating up a filamentous fungal form, and that doesn't allow the fungus to enter into the blood vessels and deeper structural organs. Whereas in a hyperglycemic status, it is seen that increased glucose level impairs the ability of the phagocytes to move towards and kill the organisms, whether it's fungus or any other organism. Steroid treatment also affects the ability of the macrophages to prevent germination of the spores. However, the exact mechanism is still unknown. We still don't know what happens in diabetes that leads to this inhibition of phagocytic activity in the tissues. Now, what's very important is that in COVID, it is known that COVID-19 sepsis or severe infection causes increased iron levels in the blood. Now, what's the connection between iron and fungus? Fungus requires iron for growth. So this picture shows that the fungus acquires iron in several forms. Suffice it to say that if iron levels increase in blood, that favors fungus. Multiple lines of evidence support the conclusion that patients in systemic acidosis have elevated levels of available serum iron. So that is a recipe for disaster. So when there is diabetes, that leads to acidosis of the blood, increased acidic pH of the blood, and that leads to release of ions from binding proteins, and that makes iron freely available in the serum, leading to easy access for fungus to take in iron and thereby grow. Another hallmark of mucormycosis is angioinvasion. Angioinvasion means invasion of the blood vessels. Angioinvasion means that the mucor elements tend to dig in deeper, get into the blood vessels, cause thrombosis or blockage of the blood vessels, and that in turn leads to decreased blood supply to the more distant tissue. So what is the blood vessel supplying? It's supplying an organ, supplying a part of the body. So when that is blocked, and when that is blocked by filamentous forms hyphae, that leads to tissue necrosis in the more distal parts of, or the forward lying areas supplied by this blood vessel. So when that happens, that leads to tissue necrosis or death of tissues supplied by that particular blood vessel. Now this also means that the fungus can get into the blood vessels itself, and there can be dissemination of the fungus into various parts of the body, leading to disseminated disease. So on-site or in-site fungal infection followed by spread of fungus to other parts, the brain, the lungs, and to other parts of the body can lead to high mortality or death rates. Is mucormycosis an epidemic today in India? This is the first and foremost question that we should ask ourselves. Now, if you look at literature, and I've read a lot of papers that deal with outbreaks of different kinds of fungus, and I've been doing a lot of research regarding what's happening with mucor in India and the rest of the world for over 2 to 3 weeks now. After having seen the first few cases, and after having seen the devastation caused by the first few cases that came to me, and since then we've been seeing a lot of cases regularly, and we've been operating several of these cases. Now this is truly an epidemic of tragic proportions. In the West, and according to literature, 2 or more cases of mucor occurring in a very short period of time should be investigated as a probable epidemic. Now what has happened in India? It's, as of yesterday, 8,840 cases. Those are reported. I don't know how many more unreported, maybe more than 10,000 cases in total have been recorded just in the last few months from I would say, I don't know, from December onwards, and a few cases were seen in the first wave also. So all put together, in the last few months, we have seen a huge outburst, and after 8 to 10,000 cases, have we declared it an epidemic? I'm not sure if it's declared an epidemic. We know that it's now a notifiable disease. This was declared a notifiable disease on May 20th, 2020, after 10,000 cases. Whereas in the West, or in other countries, developed countries, 2 or more cases of mucor have to be reported as an epidemic. If we look at the statistics in India, Maharashtra has seen the highest number of cases. Karnataka, where I come from, it's stated that 97 cases of mucor have been reported in the southern state. Number of people who have died is 0, which is not true. I know that we have more than 200 cases in Karnataka itself, maybe much more than that, and we have definitely in my own series and in several other ENT surgeons who have been operating this case, we have seen deaths. So this is not an updated list. So in what we see, we can be rest assured that there are many more cases that are not reported. So I won't be surprised if we have more than 15,000 cases, and that's a huge epidemic. If that's not an epidemic, nothing is. What are the characteristics of mucor? There are 6 types of mucor. The most important and the most dangerous form of mucor is rhino-oculocerebral mucor, which means that rhino nose, oculo eyes, cerebral is brain, and then infection that goes from the nose to the eyes and then to the brain. So this is a complex, which means that it begins in the nose, goes to the eyes, and then goes to the brain, and that they're in different phases. Then there is pulmonary mucor. The same mucor can go down into the lungs and cause lung mucormycosis. Cutaneous mucor is when the mucor affects skin, and skin penetrates the skin. Gastrointestinal mucor, as I told you before, is due to food contamination and infection in the stomach and in the gastrointestinal tract. Disseminated mucor is when, as I told you, this goes through the blood, beginning at some site in the body and then going all through the blood, causing systemic organ failure. And then there are sporadic incidents of mucose reported in several other parts, in the nails, in other systems of the body, which are, I would say, sporadic cases. What is RCOM? Rhino-oculocerebral, ROCM it is, rhino-oculocerebral mucormycosis is the most common form. So, why is ROCM the most common cause? That is because it is attributable to ketoacidosis. Now, most of these cases are seen in diabetes and in high uncontrolled diabetics. But nevertheless, we don't know what is the cause of, what's the direct correlation between high diabetes status and mucormycosis. Hyperglycemia and acidosis negatively impact neutrophilic chemotaxis and phagocytic activity, which is something I've already mentioned to you. But neutropenic patients most commonly develop pulmonary mucormycosis rather than ROCM. Okay, everywhere it should be ROCM and not RCOM. Please bear with me for this mistake. So now, why instead of pulmonary or more systemic mucormycosis, why ROCM is the one which is seen is yet to be determined. Patients in any systemic acidosis, primarily diabetic ketoacidosis, we know that, as I told you, discussed before, they have an increased availability of iron in the serum. COVID patients also have an increased iron levels in the serum. Whether it's due to diabetes or whether it is primarily seen in COVID patients, we are yet to ascertain, because COVID data is now beginning to be analyzed. We don't have access to publications coming in, and we are yet to get into the bottom of this. Now, another aspect of ROCM is that in most COVID patients who are admitted, they receive high flow nasal oxygen therapy. This is a theory which I am putting forward. Now, when a patient is getting oxygen in hospital setup or at home, we see that a lot of times, not all these oxygen sources, we may get it through inhalers, through nebulizers, through cannulas. Not all of these sources are humidified. So when there is cold air, because when it's coming directly, it is practically air at normal temperature, and it's definitely not body temperature. So there is colder air, dry air hitting the nose directly at high atmospheric pressure that contains, and a lot of these gases are compressed gases which are oxidized. We have a potential for this air itself to cause dryness and thickening. Instead of thinning the mucosal secretions, it can thicken the mucosal secretion, cause breach of mucosa, and can cause dryness, and that can create a nidus, a place where the fungus can then go and colonize or habitate. Another thing that we see is, since a lot of these infections are in the beginning diagnosed as sinusitis, and they have the same features as sinus infections, most of these people might have taken antibiotics or prescribed antibiotics, and there has to be an investigation into whether excessive use of antibiotics for so-called sinusitis can lead to commensal loss. Which means that, what is a commensal? For the layman, commensals are normal bacteria, things that we all have in our mouth, nose, and other parts of the aerodigestive tract, which kind of create a balance and kind of keep the area healthy, I would say. So if the commensals, if the good bacteria or microbes or other organisms are killed by antibiotics due to antibiotic abuse, I would say, that can then cause the unwanted or the more rarer forms of fungus like this, called like mucor, to flare up and thereby cause an imbalance in the immune system or the commensal system of the aerodigestive tract, leading to mucormycosis. The initial symptoms can, as I told you, can very well match sinusitis, and that's the reason why it's very rare to see very early infection. Periorbital cellulitis, more or less, is a characteristic feature of ROCM. Eye or facial pain, facial numbness are again characteristic features. Eye pain, facial pain, that is when you have heaviness on the face due to sinus infection, due to sinuses getting filled up, and due to debris getting accumulated. Conjunctival suffusion, blurry vision, soft tissue swelling means that these infections have come out of the sinuses and have infiltrated the eyes, the cheeks, and probably now going towards the brain. Now, fever can be variable. In about 50% of the cases, there may not be any fever. However, the white blood counts are always elevated in infections of any kind, in fact. If untreated, the patients usually get infections traveling from the sinuses into the orbit, and thereby, as I told, into the brain. Infected tissues may appear normal in the initial phase. This was a patient came very early. So in the earlier phases, it may look very, very benign. Okay, and as I told you, a lot of these things overlap with other routine fungal infections, routine sinusitis and tonsillitis and other things. But development of a black necrotic eschar means that the blood vessels have undergone thrombosis and there is a necrosis, which means that there is a decay in that particular organ, and that is typical of mucormycosis. Infections can also come down into the oral cavity, leading to blackening of the palate and into the tonsillar areas as well. I don't want to scare people, because some of this people, the audience for this presentation may be the public and laymen as well. So I'm not going to throw very scary pictures and scary surgical pictures, but definitely I would like to take you through the clinical pathway, which is quite scary. Progressive loss of vision is one of the, I would say, in stage 2 this happens, and once the eyes are infected, it's very difficult to save the eyes. In this picture you can see that the eye here on one side is completely involved by mucor. Cranial nerve, that is 5th cranial nerve, 7th cranial nerve involvement can lead to ipsilateral loss of facial sensation, ptosis and pupillary dilatation. Spread can be into the orbit, into the sinuses and directly into the cerebral central nervous system. And once the brain has been affected, this leads to carotid artery encasement and cerebral infarctions, from which patient almost never recovers fully. What is the treatment available? What are the investigations one would like to know about or do in COVID in mucormycosis infections? It is very important for both the patient and the doctor to have a high index of suspicion. Now that we know that we are in a serious mess, there is mucor all around, please, from patient point of view, please report to the doctor immediately if you have COVID in the past, and especially if you have had COVID and diabetes in the past or presently. HRCT PNS is mandatory. Sinus mucosal thickenings are a very clear indication. Again, this may mimic sinusitis in the early phase. No abnormalities can be seen in the bony system, but later on the bone also gets infected, and if the bone gets infected and if there is sinusitis in a young person especially, then definitely this indicates. Okay, so what are the MRI characteristics? MRI, I would say, is quite a clincher as far as mucormycosis is concerned, and it's the investigation of choice, especially contrast enhanced MRI. So it's the lesions are isointense in T1, T2 they may show variable signals. The fungal elements themselves tend to have low signals on T2. So, but it's with contrast that the necrotic areas and the non-necrotic areas differentiate nicely. And the necrotic areas do not take up contrast, and some of the turbinates, when they are necrosed, they lead to what is called a black turbinate sign, which is quite pathognomic of mucormycosis. Histopathology again is a must, and histopathology is what actually determines whether this disease is mucor or not. Culture is not always possible, because first and foremost culture takes time. It's not easy to get to isolate fungal elements from cultures of, let's say, blood, CSF, sputum, urine, feces, and other fluids or tissues. And as I told you, waiting for fungal culture may actually delay treatment. So it's what becomes important here is actually biopsy. So taking a biopsy from the infected site clearly gives a indication as to whether this is mucor or not. Now, diagnosis is made by studying this biopsied material under the microscope, wherein the mucor species are aseptate, and they show branching of their hyphal elements at right angles, whereas the branching of other fungal species happen at acute angles, and they show septae as well. So this is how we differentiate, let's say, an aspergillosis from a mucor, and it's quite easy to differentiate mucor from other fungal infections. Now coming on to treatment. So treatment essentially has two components. One is the medical line of management as well as surgical line of management. Now a lot of these mucor species show broad range of susceptibilities. They are not always susceptible to amphotericin B, which is liposomal amphotericin B, which is actually the drug of choice here. So most of them do respond very well to liposomal amphotericin B, but some of them may not, and that's something that needs to be taken into account. Now, due to the fact that the tissue necrosis is present in in large areas, and this is a characteristic feature of mucor. Antifungal penetration will be poor into some of these necrotic areas, and that's where the problem lies, and that's the reason why antifungal treatment alone cannot be a treatment policy for mucormycosis. Surgery is necessary to remove these necrotic areas, and the necrotic areas too harbor fungi, and that's the reason why they have to be removed for effective resolution of this disease. Now, it's also seen, this particular study also tells us that antifungal therapy does not work in isolation, because it may kill the spores, but the spores may come up again in the future, leading to a resurgence of infection in a so-called cured patient. Now, in this particular study, IV doses of heat-killed mucor blastospores were injected into diabetic mice, and this resulted in a 40% mortality in the mice. So, using just IV antifungals alone without surgical clearance of the necrotic area may be perilous, due to the fact that some of these spores may show resurgence later on. Now, at our institution, we follow this broad set of guidelines. Now, here you see that when a patient presents to us, we first initiate antifungal treatment using liposomal amphotericin B at a certain dose recommended by the infectious disease specialist. Surgical debridement and clearance is given top priority, and this is always an accepted and an important form of our treatment policy. So diagnosis is done, staging is done, and then if surgical intervention is necessary, it is done on top priority. While steroids are tried to be tapered, immunosuppressants are taken off, and we try to see if it can be taken off if it's not needed. And it's absolutely important to control hypoglycemia and to make sure that the blood sugar levels are well maintained. Now, if this works, then we move into what is called the secondary prophylactic phase, where we start isavuconazole or posaconazole as maintenance therapy for close to 6 to 8 weeks. If there is no improvement, then we consider continuation of liposomal amphotericin B at a higher dose, and then, if necessary, do a second surgical debridement, and if necessary, WBC transfusions and other things are given in the terminal stage, but at that stage it doesn't really work because the patient will be deteriorated to a large extent. Now, there are some unanswered questions here as far as the epidemic on mucormycosis is concerned. Now, why do we have such mind-boggling numbers in such a short time? Why have there been a report of over 10,000 cases in the last few months? That is quite baffling, I would say. Why haven't other fungal species, which are seen more commonly in immunocompromised patients, why have they not manifested themselves? Why is it mucor, which is quite a rare species, even if it is seen in diabetes, why has it come up in such a big way? Why are young adults being affected by it? I have seen patients who have either had no COVID, no oxygen supply, no steroid intake, no history of steroid intake. I've seen a young person contact me with black patches in his palate, who had COVID infection a year back, and he had not been on any treatment in the recent past. So we have a huge spectrum of patients who present to us. The diabetic elderly patients being the most, I would say, likely people to get mucor. But at the same time, we have seen a lot of younger patients too being afflicted by this condition. And that is quite perplexing, because of the fact that they don't appear to be so immunocompromised. In this particular study that was done in 2015, this is a fairly detailed analysis of all the fungal outbreaks that happened in the last few decades, I would say, right up to 2015. And if you see, I'm not very sure if it's very clear on the screen, because it's a little, I would say, miniaturized. So if you can see the causative organism here, most of the causative organisms are aspergillosis. Mucor figures rarely, and in fact, if I remember right, in one of the studies, only 16 outbreaks of mucor were reported from 1966 to 2008. So, and all of those series had very few cases, less than 5 to 7 cases in each one of these series, some as low as 2 to 3 cases. So, which brings us to a very pertinent question. Now, we have evaluated the pathogenesis, we have attributed some of the causative factors to be patient specific, which means that they could be diabetic, they could be immunosuppressed. COVID itself can contribute by increasing the ferritin levels, iron levels, and blah blah blah. So we have discussed all this. So these are all patient characteristics predisposing to mucor. But by focusing solely on some of these characteristics, we are clearly neglecting looking into the possibility of a new source of contamination of mucor. Now, whenever there is an epidemic, one of the first things that is done, and we see several this in most established institutions, and in most developed countries, there are standard operating protocols to actually determine a source for the epidemic. Now, are we doing this at this point of time? We are not. So we need to now start looking at possible sources of infection as well. We need to trace possible contaminated sources of infection, and this needs to be done in top priority. And I'm going to list out some of the things that I personally felt have been neglected or not touched upon in some of our discussions by experts on the topic of this mucor epidemic or wave that's coming up with the second wave of COVID infections. Now, it's very important. I would give 50% weightage to both of these things, patient factors and source factors. If the source factors are controlled well, we may very well see a sharp decline in the number of cases, because eventually the source itself becomes the main contributing factor in a immunocompromised patients. Before COVID, we had a lot of immunocompromised. We used to treat a lot of immunocompromised patients. Diabetes, there was the whole diabetic situation was as it is now as it was before. But why didn't we see some mucor cases at all? And that's because now we have a source that is affecting the immunocompromised patients that come into some of our hospitals. So what are these sources? There are sources at home, there are sources in hospitals, and there are sources in the gaseous supply chains. These are the three major areas that I'm going to touch upon now. At home, nutrients at home, dust, water favor fungal growth on building materials. Now, I come from Mangalore, and Mangalore is a very humid place. There is a lot of moisture in the air. It's a coastal city, and India is a long coastline. So when in such cities, we see that moisture affects or causes fungal growth in most of our homes. Growing up in a coastal city, I saw fungal patches in my homes practically all the time, and we had to get our house painted quite frequently because of the fact that the walls grew fungus. Now, fiberglass, galvanized steel accumulated with dust or lubricant oil residues also allow growth of fungus. Now, the whole of India is in a temperate, has a temperate climate, and this clearly harbors the growth of fungus. pH range of 5 to 6.5 in building materials allows the best growth of most of the fungi. Now, due to the pandemic, we are all staying indoors and we are all shut indoors. Most of us are, the people are working from home. Barring the medical fraternity, most of the community is staying indoors. Now, when we're staying indoors, we need to see how effectively we are disposing our waste at home. Now, due to the pandemic, there has been a disruption in the waste collection systems. Earlier, we used to get our segregated waste collected almost every day, if not once in 2 days. Now we are seeing that go up to 1 week or 10 days. Sometimes in some parts of this city and in several other cities, I'm sure, we see that waste segregation doesn't happen on a regular basis as regularly as it used to happen before the pandemic began. So when we have waste lying down at home, there is a good chance that the fungal elements grow in some of the decaying food waste, or the other waste that are lying at home for a long period of time. This leading along with the fact that we are staying indoors for a prolonged period of time can lead to a recipe for disaster. Now that apart, our AC vents and our AC systems both at home and in the workplace needs to be looked into. Now if there is a huge deposit of fungal mold or something as shown in this picture in our AC vents, and then if we end up staying indoors most of the time, that again is a recipe for disaster, because some of these fungal molds can easily be inhaled, and that increases the overall spore content in the air. Now if there are pots kept in the house, and if there are a lot of curtains, upholstery, carpets and other things, that again tends to add to the fungal load, or the spore load in the house. Now all this was, you may tell me that all this was there even before the pandemic began, but now we are staying indoors, so that's what's essentially changed. The fact that we have long lockdowns, and this particular lockdown in Bangalore has lasted for close to a month and a half, in fact. So that would mean that we are constantly inhaling these spores and kind of cycling it back into the home environment. So it's recommended that UV lamps and UV devices be used to constantly clean up or to disinfect some of the AC vents or other ventilation units at home or in the workplace. The next most important thing, and I want to dwell upon this point for some time, is the use of masks during the COVID pandemic. Now we've all been accustomed to wearing masks practically the entire day, and mask usage has become a characteristic feature of the COVID pandemic. Now using masks obviously has prevented the spread of the pandemic to a great extent. There are a lot of benefits with mask usage, but at the same time we must know that masks have to be used in a sanitized way. There is a correct way to use masks. Now there are more than 700 species of microbes in the mouth itself, and as we speak, when I put on this mask, for instance, I blow air, I exhale air, and water droplets, saliva droplets come out from the upper aerodigestive tract into the masks. So this leads to moisture accumulation and also food particles and other things accumulate in the mask. And in combination with the fact that in India, we being a hot country, humid country, this can again be a recipe for disaster. So masks should never be used for long periods of time. Disposable masks are meant to be disposed. I would say the N95 mask should not be used for more than 2 days. I myself end up using this for sometimes 3 or 4 days, but that should not be done. The cloth masks have to be washed practically on a daily basis, and proper care has to be taken while putting on and removing the mask. Sanitize your hands. Make sure you don't keep touching your masks every now and then after, let's say, going to the washrooms, going to the going to public areas. If you're touching things everywhere, and then you have this habit of touching a mask every now and then, that's not good. Also the use of double masks. Now people are I see a lot of people using 2 masks, which is good, which is great, but make sure your masks are changed or sterilized quite often, and that's a very, very important factor. And this could be one of the factors that play a role in development of mucor in seemingly healthy young adults who have had no history of COVID or no history of hospitalization. Another very important aspect of the mask story is that India has moved from being the lowest, I would say, the zero PPE producer in the world to being the world's second largest PPE producer today in a short span of 1 year. Now that's commendable. The government has promoted PP production, mass production, and several smaller units, household units, I would say, are now engaged in PP kit production, mass production, which is all great. The industry has prospered, proliferated, but at the same time, are we ensuring that all these PPE mask manufacturing factories are strictly following SOPs laid down by the government? I have a serious concern. I have serious doubts. We've had sporadic incidences where reports have shown us that there have been units which have not been following the standard SOPs. How well are we disposing some of these masks and PPE kits? Are they being recycled illegally? So all these things have to be seen, and we need to monitor this aspect very, very carefully. There are a list of do's and don'ts which are available all over the net. I'm sure most of you know about this. So wash soiled masks regularly. I'm talking about cloth masks. Wash your hands before you keep touching your masks, before wearing masks. Social distancing have to be maintained despite wearing a mask. Make sure it fits snugly. Again, a mask that fits very closely onto your face can lead to a lot of contamination itself, so it's a double-edged sword. Making sure that it snugly fits also has its, I would say, demerits, and that can mean that a lot of vapor, saliva, moisture, food particles can also be accumulated on the surface of the mask, and that can be quite dangerous. So do not keep touching, as I told you, your masks every now and then. Do not wear soiled masks. I see people whose masks are all brown. In fact, they've probably worn it for more than 15 days. Never do that. That's a recipe for disaster, as I told you. Do not touch your eyes and mouth after you've after removing the mask, and make sure that kids stay away from mask contamination. Now, excessive use of antibiotics is a very important issue. So patients are for the drop of a hat, for very minor symptoms, taking antibiotics. Online consultation again is a double-edged sword, I would say. I used to do a lot of online consultations in the recent past, but then I've kind of stopped doing that now, because I feel that when we have a lot of calls coming in for very mundane, seemingly benign issues like very minimal throat irritation, headaches, minor itches, minor symptoms, and when they call, you don't have an opportunity to examine some of these patients, and you end up giving them medicines for the sake of giving medicines, because something has to be done. There is a consultation. You can't examine, obviously. You don't know what's happening, and you end up prescribing tablets for the sake of prescribing, and a lot of these tablets are antibiotics. So what I mean is, online consultations become superficial, and that has a downside to it, because giving medicines routinely when it's probably not needed would lead to a problem. Now, what happens with excessive use of antibiotics is also that normal commensals in the upper aerodigestive tract get eliminated. Now, we don't know what protective roles the commensals have in the upper aerodigestive tract. Eliminating the commensals quite routinely using antibiotics for very mundane symptoms, I think also has a contributing factor to the flare-up of infections like mucor, which otherwise are very rare. Now, coming to a very important aspect of this whole affair is the spotlight on the use of steroids. Now, I condone the use of steroids by patients. Patients should not be given, or they should not be taking steroids over the counter. A lot of people know that steroids are used in the management of COVID, but that is best left to the physician. In the hospital, patients should not have access to steroids. This is very important. But having said that, is the use of steroid in COVID related symptoms or diseases leading to a flare-up in mucor? I don't think so. If you look at this particular screenshot here, I did a Google search for steroid and mucormycosis on Google, and I did the same for the same keywords in PubMed, which is a more scientific platform where all the scientific peer-reviewed articles are published. Now, if you look at the Google search, you'll see that there were 15-20 pages of information coming in about steroid, how steroid can be dangerous, both because it's used by the public and also because steroids are used in the treatment of COVID. And most of these quotes were in the media, and most of these were by I would say, eminent persons in the medical fraternity, and there were a lot of reports out in the Indian section of the media, especially, where steroids were I would say blamed, or spoken about as one of the most important factors in the development of Mucor. At the same time, the same keyword search in PubMed led to only 3 articles. Those were also sporadic articles, unrelated articles, I would say, not very specific articles related to the topic. And if you see, the search period extends from 1970s to till date. And this clearly proves that scientific literature doesn't support the role of support the argument that steroids would probably predispose to mucor infections. And I've had personal discussions with a lot of microbiologists, with a lot of infectious disease control specialists, and they've all told me that steroid per se may not be a very important contributing factor, because we've used steroids for decades now, and we've not had any, and for a variety of causes. It's used quite routinely in a lot of critical areas in the hospital, and none of these these patients have actually developed mucor, or there have been no mucor outbreaks. But yes, the role of steroids has to be investigated closely. Now, steam inhalation. Again, I did a lot of, I told you, online consultations when there were lockdown periods and we were restricted to home. So it was a good opportunity to, to keep oneself busy. So, but when I did a lot of consultations, and during online consultations, I heard from patients that a lot of people are now doing steam inhalation, and they consider it to be preventive or protective against COVID, mucor, and other things. So, taking a quote from the internet, it is said that the key benefit of inhaling in moist, warm steam is that it may help alleviate irritation, and it may also support thinning of the mucus in your sinuses, in the throat, in the chest and other things. So it also relaxes throat muscles, they say, lessens soreness, inflammation, and dilate blood vessels, improving blood circulation. However, it must be said that steam inhalation should not be done. Steam inhalation, in fact, can be counterproductive. Why is this? So, how is it that steam inhalation can be harmful? The reason being that when you inhale steam, you inhale a lot of nebulized water droplets. Now, the size of these water droplets is anything between 1 to 40 microns. When water comes in through, let's say, a humidifier or a nebulizer, this is in the form of water vapor. And water vapor is, has a size of about 0.001 microns. Now, when water is in the form of droplets and we inhale them, it's possible for this water droplets to carry viruses, bacteria, fungi, and a lot of other microbes into the nasal passages, whereas water vapor by itself is too small to carry all these microbials. So it's very important to note that steam inhalation can lead to potentially inhaling the microbes along with the water droplets. I just came across a fancy piece of information, or a write-up on steam inhalation in an Instagram post, where it said that steam inhalation can be, along with steam inhalation, one can use carom seeds, tulsi seeds, and mint leaves and other things, and this has to be done 2 to 3 times a day. And it's said that you'll see your nasal congestion disappearing soon. And it goes on to say that this water isn't just good for inhalation but also for drinking. So here you have people putting plant matter which could also harbor fungi into the inhalation cocktail, and also drinking it or ingesting it. That's definitely a cocktail for disaster, and I strongly recommend that one should not use steam inhalation in the current situation, and definitely not other use it along with other herbs or whatever that's recommended sometimes by some other people. Now, coming on to oxygen concentrators. Oxygen concentrators are devices which concentrate oxygen and it can be used effectively in patients who are having a slight dip in oxygen saturation, but who are asymptomatic and who can receive treatment at home. So government has now made it possible for import of oxygen saturation by individuals, and I've got a lot of patients calling me and asking what brand to buy, and I know a lot of my patients and my people whom I know have bought oxygen concentrators. Now, we all have bought oxygen concentrators, but how much do we know about them? It's very important that when somebody uses an oxygen concentrator, again, like a humidifier, these concentrators have to be well maintained. They have to be sterilized. The water that's used in the oxygen concentration, like in a humidifier, has to be distilled or sterile water and not tap water. Tap water is at lower temperature than the body, and the tap water can be contaminated, and when this kind of is sent up into the nasal passage, it can cause the same harm that a steam inhalation can cause. Now, I know there are viral messages going around in WhatsApp and other forum of communication where it is recommended that methylene blue can be added into tap water and that can be used in concentrators, humidifiers. Most definitely not. So it's very important that we do not contaminate the water used in any of these devices. Now, the use of methylene blue again can add to the burden of throwing out the methylene blue, and this can add to the problem, and it's most definitely not advisable to use methylene blue inside humidifiers or in oxygen concentrators. Now, coming on to other potential sources. So we spoke about sources in at homes, community acquired sources due to bad practices. Now, what about hospitals? How safe are the hospitals? Now, a nosocomial infection can be defined as an infection acquired in a hospital by a patient who was admitted for a reason other than that particular infection. So, any hospital acquired infection, in other words, is called a nosocomial infection. Now, the highest frequencies of hospital acquired infections are people or patients getting infected for some other reason, some other infection other than the original reason of admission, and that is called nosocomial infection. This is highest in the South and Southeast Asian country and the East Mediterranean countries. What is the cause of nosocomial infection? Patient susceptibility itself is a cause. So anybody with low immune status, transplant patients, malignancy patients, patients with diabetes mellitus, extremes of life, young patients, old patients, all these patients can be predisposed to nosocomial infection, and when they get into a hospital setup where there is a source of contamination, they will immediately be susceptible to infections. That apart, the instruments that are used in diagnostic and therapeutic procedures, biopsies, endoscopic exam, catheterization, intubation, ventilation, surgical procedures, all of this can cause cross-contamination and lead to infection of, let's say, mucor in a patient admitted for the other causes. That apart, crowding of hospitals, which is what we see now with a huge number of COVID admissions, the turnover time between patients is very less. So I would say it's a very precarious situation, bad healthcare setting. Cross-infection can be a potential source of mucor infection. Now, mucor infection, if you go through the literature, has moved from being a community-acquired infection to purely a nosocomial infection in the Western world, which means that almost all of the mucor cases are now seen in nosocomial as a form of nosocomial infection, which is a hospital-acquired infection. So in the West, mucor is predominantly seen in transplant patients, malignant patients, and other highly immunocompromised patients. Whereas in India, diabetes mellitus and ketoacidosis and other things also form a basis for mucor infections. Now, if you look at the causes of nosocomial infections in reported mucor outbreaks, you will see that a lot of hospital stuff can cause mucor: linen, bandages, catheters, nasogastric tubes, surgery. Now, in a hospital setting, mucor has to be treated as we would treat a COVID patient, with all the precautions taken in a COVID patient. Otherwise, there can be a cross contamination. If we operate mucor cases in normal surgical operating theaters, that is definitely a recipe again for disaster. If the mucor patients are kept in common ICUs, then that again can lead to a lot of problems. Coming on to another potential source of contamination, we are talking about medical oxygen sources. Now, what are medical oxygen sources? So, medical grade oxygen comes from oxygen plants and liquid oxygen producing factories. Now, oxygen plants are seen in most big hospitals, and they have in-house oxygen plants where oxygen is directly supplied into the piping that goes to supply the ICUs and the more critical areas which require oxygen. Liquid oxygen plants are plants that are outside hospitals, and these plants produce oxygen, liquid oxygen, which are then transferred to cylinders, which are shown in the first the picture that you see on the left. And these cylinders are brought to smaller hospitals or into places where there is no in-house supply of oxygen. That apart, concentrators, as I told you earlier, are also sources of medical oxygen. Now, how hygienic are these medical oxygen cylinders? I've been doing a little bit of research over the last few weeks, and I've seen that these cylinders are stored in very dingy rooms without ventilation. These cylinders are, according to SOPs, supposed to be sterilized, but I know that they are not routinely sterilized. Also, because of the immense pressure on the medical systems that are caused due to the existing massive wave of the COVID pandemic that we see today. So again, the turnover time between cylinders, turnover time between patients is very less, and this leads to contamination of the medical cylinders. These cylinders are not often cleaned. I was told by hospital authorities that this is to be cleaned by the suppliers, the distributors. I was told by the distributors that they don't get time, or some of the distributors told it that it is not their job to do it. It is to be done in the plants. The buck is passed. However, I get this feeling from my own investigation research that oxygen cylinders are not being cleaned according to SOPs, if any. Now, I'm not very sure if there are SOPs for cleaning of all these things. I've spoken to some of the regular suppliers of medical grade oxygen. They say that they make sure that this goes through a lengthy process of sterilization, but whether it is done presently, what is the bearing of this enormous workload that is what is the bearing of this on the sterility protocols being followed is to be seen, and according to me, there's a big question mark here, and this needs to be thoroughly investigated. One of these pictures now that I saw when I was googling up things, kind of tells the whole story. So some of these cylinders probably make their way into very critical areas in the hospital, and today we see that a lot of beds or hospital areas are created wherein patients are kept there for a reasonable amount of time. Patients who do not need critical care are kept in beds like general ward beds, and we see oxygen cylinders sometimes being brought right up to their doorstep or their to the bedside of some of these patients. And I know some hospitals where there's so much of work that the medical staff cannot give individual attention to each of these patients. So some of the patients themselves are asked to operate some of these cylinders and adjust the settings accordingly, because it's not too complicated. Now when such cylinders are brought into the hospitals, definitely there can be contamination, and these can be again recipes of disaster as far as mucormycosis is concerned. Humidifiers, have touched upon this a while back, but in the hospital setting, a humidifier is a very, very important paraphernalia, I would say. So the oxygen comes from pipes into humidifiers, and from here the oxygen is given to the patients. Now these humidifiers play a very important role in humidifying, as the name says, humidifying the gases, especially oxygen. Now, due to again less patient turnover time, due to the immense load on the medical system today, the water which is used in humidifiers are not looked into. I know a lot of places which, where normal tap water is being used in the humidifiers instead of distilled or sterile water. When this happens, again, water contains spores, bacterial elements, fungal elements, and when this is inhaled, this can lead to potential disaster. Again, cold water, tap water, if used, that can that is not coming, and if the temperature control regulation is not there in the humidifiers, this is again a problem, because cold and dry gas reaches the upper airway, and this can cause abrasions in the nasal mucosa, and that can again lead to seeding of fungus. Another aspect of humidifiers is that a lot of people, especially medical staff, assume that the flow of air is unidirectional from the cylinder to the patient, and nothing would be coming back from the patients into the humidifiers, which is not true. Again, this comes from detailed discussions that I've had with people who manufacture these devices, and they tell me that the flow is bidirectional, and a lot of times microbial contamination occurs due to the backflow of organisms back into the humidifier, and that's the reason if you do not sterilize these humidifiers on a routine, practically on a daily basis, there is trouble brewing there. Now this is a diagrammatic representation of the oxygen supply chains, and you'll see that there are a lot of steps or levels that the gas goes through before it reaches critical area, from the outside air that's taken in right into the operating room or ICUs or more critical areas. So the contamination can occur in the atmosphere, in the room from where the air comes in the compressor, or in the distribution equipment. So pipelines have been incriminated. This particular study showed that the amount of microbial flora that is there in the beginning of the chain is the same as the microbial flora that's coming out of the output pipes. So that clearly shows that organisms can be carried through this whole supply chain within, or the pipelines within the hospital setup. So the highest bacterial counts were obviously seen in the ICUs, and the highest fungal counts were again without surprise seen in the emergency room, which has constant communication to the outside environment because trolleys keep coming and going into the emergency rooms. So in the West, there are strict parameters and SOPs that are, and regular checks are being done throughout the oxygen supply chain to see that there is no contamination, or the bacterial or fungal growths do not go above a certain harmful level. Even in such controlled systems, and where organization constantly work to see that oxygen supply chains or gaseous supply chains are not contaminated, even there culturing of medical gases are rarely performed. Particulate, foreign bodies and bacteria are not the usual part of certification of medical gases. Now, what does this mean? Studies have shown, and this particular paper is a case in point, saying that these studies clearly say, and it's a valid point, that medical air is a result of compression of 8 cubic feet of atmospheric air into 1 cubic feet of compressed air. Now, when you compress air, you are compressing all the contaminants as well, dust, rust, whatever, and microbes. When you compress microbes and there is a concentration of these contaminants, and that is a huge problem, because now you're sending, it's like a funneling effect. You're taking things, concentrating, and then sending it across the oxygen supply chains. Documented contamination of pipelines in the hospitals in the West includes dirt, sand, gravel, cement, rust, vermin, cigarette butts, and wood. And lo and behold, the largest particulate matter recently found, according to the study, was a bird that had been sucked into the medical gas system as a result of faulty construction of medical gas pipeline. So now, how often are we checking our own oxygen supply chains? My investigation shows that this is not commonly done, especially in this setting where there is a huge workload and there is practically no time for anybody to get into checking what's happening in the oxygen supply chains. To add to that, there is a very, very important aspect that we need to look into. Now, during the second wave of COVID-19, we saw a huge shortage of oxygen supply. Courts were breathing upon governments to increase oxygen supplies. There was panic everywhere, tragedy everywhere, people dying. We saw, very, very tragic news of people dying due to oxygen supplies, people on the streets without oxygen. So what the government did was, it mandated, or it allowed liquid nitrogen producing facilities to produce oxygen, liquid oxygen, which meant that liquid nitrogen factories, and nitrogen is used in automobile industry, it's used in the food packaging industry, the chips packet that you use, see is puffed up because of nitrogen gases in it. The tires that are filled with, the automobile industry uses nitrogen inside tires. So all these units have been asked, requested, or probably ordinated to be converted to oxygen supplies units as of date. So this is a very good move, I would say, and a lot of lives have been saved due to this timely intervention by the government of India, and the government of India has to be commended and appreciated, and to an extent, I would say the oxygen supply deficit has been kind of bridged, and we are no longer facing that kind of deficit that we saw about a month back. Now, this means that PSO, that is Petroleum Explosive and Explosive Safety Organization, issued guidelines, and you can see the guidelines here. I've taken a print, a screenshot to show you the guidelines, and these guidelines put a caveat right on top of the SOPs that have been issued for the liquid nitrogen plants and liquid argon plants who are now manufacturing oxygen. They clearly say, the SOP list here clearly says that such conversion is not a safe practice and not followed internationally. Extreme precautions will be taken by the applicant for such conversion, and then it goes on to say that these are the guidelines to be followed, which include sterilization protocols and other things. Now, we know that the whole industrial oxygen supply, industrial or medical grade, whatever it is, these oxygen supply chain goes through a long process, right from the point where the liquid oxygen is produced to transported in oxygen tankers, which were erstwhile nitrogen tankers, to the point where oxygen cylinders, which were probably erstwhile nitrogen cylinders, they being brought to the hospital. So that whole process is a long process, and contamination is pretty easy to occur. I would say it's practically a given when it goes through the this long process, and I'm personally of the opinion that this supply chain should be seriously looked into. Guidelines have been issued, but are the industrial manufacturing units informed, equipped, trained to supply medical grade oxygen? Are they following the SOPs that have been laid down by the government? And if not, have there been checks? And what is the check in place to see that the new oxygen supply chain that has been established, wherein industrial units are now producing oxygen to supply the deficit. What checks have been placed to make sure that these are hygienic is what needs to be investigated, and this has to be done on top priority, because if we have such centrally located contaminated sources, that could very well explain the huge surge of mucor cases that we see today. So this is, I'm not going to go into all the points, but yes, I put in all the points that have been laid down as SOPs by PESO, but are they being followed is what needs to be seen. To add to this, government has also relaxed the rules for application of licenses for production of new oxygen units, and the existing licenses have been extended for a few more months, considering that there is absolute need of oxygen at this point of time. Now, as of today, as far as I know, you can start oxygen unit and then get license later on. So a lot of players are coming into the field, and we need to see how many of them are really equipped or knowledgeable about medical grade oxygen, and are they producing medical grade oxygen and sterile medical grade oxygen, and this has to be very, very seriously looked into, because as I told you, any central large scale contamination can lead to a disaster, as we are seeing today. Now, I did a little bit of research into what could potentially happen when nitrogen units are now are being used to produce oxygen. What's the relation between fungi and nitrogen? I came across very interesting articles where they say that nitrogen is very essential for fungal growth, and fungi produce nitrogen too, and they play a very important role in the nitrogen cycle. There are two of these articles which clearly say that nitrogen is an essential requirement of growth. Now, we are using nitrogen facilities to produce oxygen. What if there is an inherent contamination of these nitrogen producing units? This has all been done in good faith. This has saved a lot of lives, I would say thousands of lives, but is there an alien that's infiltrating into the system due to this new oxygen supply chains? Now, we also know from literature that fungus can be preserved using a cryogenic oxygen. In fact, one of the modes of preservation of fungi is to put them in cryogenic nitrogen cylinders. So this particular study says that viable and unmutated cultures were developed from reactivated specimens that were stored in cryogenic nitrogen facilities or containers for as long as 5 years. So this clearly shows that if the spores would like to, they would survive in a cryogenic nitrogen atmosphere, and we are talking about cryogenic nitrogen plants and cylinders being used for production of cryogenic oxygen. So cryogenic, as I told you, American Type Cultures Collection Organization in fact recommends freezing fungal spores or fungal specimen in cryogenic temperatures minus 130 degree to store fungus. Now, in Europe, we have what is called the EIGA, which is European Industrial Gas Association, and they have come up with guidelines, and they regulate the supply of medical oxygen to hospitals. So it is generally believed, and when I spoke to intensivists, anesthesiologists, and in my research into this matter, I was told in the beginning that all these gases are produced in sterile environments, which is true, because in the gas production phase, sterility is ensured because of the fact that these gases are produced in extremely low temperatures, minus 130, minus 150 degrees. And they are stored in cryogenic temperatures in liquid form, which then evaporate and produce the gaseous form, which is then taken into the piping in the hospitals. However, the same a scientific report from EIGA. This particular report clearly mentions that there are some organisms which are able to thrive in extreme environment, and I have already told you that cryogenic temperatures do not kill spores. In fact, they are used to ferry spores around. So these extremophiles include, for example, high pressure phials, anhydrobiotic organisms, and low pH phile microbes. So during regular analysis by EIGA in the West, they have determined that less than 100 CFE per Newton meter cube and 50 CFE per Newton meter cube respectively of bacteria and fungi are acceptable levels of organisms, which means that if there is less than 50 CFE per Newton meter cube, in any part of the oxygen supply chain, that's acceptable. And these are the guidelines laid down by EIGA. However, samples taken by EIGA have also shown that organisms have grown in air cylinders, and the inner surface of cylinders which host liquid nitrogen, liquid oxygen, have been contaminated by fungi and other bacterial microbes. So, and they also say that there is a possibility of contamination when the cylinder is opened and closed. When the walls are being opened and closed, they have to be done in an aseptic way, and if that's not followed, it is possible to have ambient air contamination. And there's very clear evidence in all the analysis done by this organization that microbial load remains adhered to the internal walls of the cylinders, which are supposed to be sterile. Okay. Now, the Asian Industrial Gases Association have laid down the following guidelines during handling of cylinders and other gaseous equipments during the COVID pandemic. There's a series of things. You can read it. I can probably share it with you if you write back to me at and my emails come up at the end of the show. So I can share some of this information. So they recommend wearing PPE, they recommend disinfecting it on a routine basis, the whole set of guidelines, but I am very sure that none of these things are being followed as far as we are concerned in India, and we are so short-staffed that this is definitely not a priority when it comes to treating COVID or Mucor patients. Again, guidelines, I can go on and on. There are WHO guidelines, UNICEF guidelines, all these organizations have set up SOPs and guidelines to monitor microbial growth and decontamination of the medical supply chain. You can go through all these articles. I've read all of them, and I am reasonably sure that our oxygen supply chains, even during the normal times, non-COVID era, I would say, are not optimal, and we need to look into this very, very seriously, especially in this milieu of mucormycosis epidemic. So now, having been through this journey, I would say, of information relating to mucormycosis, what do we do at the end of the day? What is the exigency, and what are we proposing, or what are we supposed to do? Now, let's begin with a slide that showed what happened in a pediatric oncology unit in this particular article. There was a small mucor outbreak in about which was seen in about 3 or 4 patients in a pediatric oncology unit. The first thing that they did was they went into the source of this particular outbreak. They found that this was secondary to water damage in a linen store and patient's shower room. They found 2 sources where they found mucormycosis. The source of the outbreak was successfully determined using simple environmental sampling techniques, and sampling allowed timely and successful implementation of infection control measures, and this small outbreak of 2 to 3 patients was controlled effectively. Now, what are we looking at? We are looking at 10,000 patients across all hospitals in India. That happened in the last few months. The first thing that we have to do is determine the source of the outbreak. Now, for which we have to move from the philosophy that these outbreaks are caused due to patient factors and due to the fact that there is increased diabetes in the Indian population, diabetic ketoacidosis, and always blaming COVID and patient-related factors. I am not denying that. That's definitely it plays an important role. But unless we look at the source of infection, I think we are missing. We are barking up the wrong tree, or I would say we are missing the woods for the forest. Now, there is this particular article which did a study of all the mucormycosis outbreaks that has happened in the past. If you see that there are very few, there have been only 12 hospital outbreaks, and all of these outbreaks show very few mucor cases, 2, 3, 2, 4, 5, less than 5 to 7 cases in all these outbreaks, and all of them have been reported, and only 12 outbreaks have been reported from, mucor outbreaks have been reported from 1966 to 2008. Now again, we're talking about 10,000 cases over the last few months. All these cases were investigated. If you look at it, the source of, you see this picture source, you see all of these outbreaks were investigated for the source. That's the first thing one does when there is an outbreak. You would have seen the movie Contagion, you would have seen the movie Outbreak, you would have seen a lot of documentaries on outbreaks. What do? Ebola outbreak, you go and find out what's the source, which is precisely what we are neglecting, ignoring, and we are completely turning a blind eye to the possibility even of a source of contamination. That's not the right approach to dealing with mucormycosis. And at this stage, I implore upon hospital authorities and the governmental authorities to kindly also look at a possible contaminated source, especially when we have I've enumerated so many causes, and these are not only hospital specific or production specific. There are also community specific things like steam inhalation, mask. So all this has to be brought out into the public. We have to start discussing this, and I think this presentation, and I think this is one of the first presentations, and we are one of the first people in the country to raise this red flag. And let me say, I know for sure that something good is going to come out of this when we start moving in the direction of investigating the source of infection. Infection control programs have to be set. Infection control committees have to be set. The management should be involved. I'm talking about hospital, executive, microbiologists, physicians, pharmacists, nursing staff. Some of the articles go up to the extent of saying that in this committee, the linen head, the waste disposal chief, even the canteen chief, the food supply chief should all be a part of this committee, and that's how seriously it is taken in other countries. Remember that mucor is a problem specific to India. It is not seen as a problem in either the first wave, second, third wave in all the other countries outside this subcontinent. Now, when we have an outbreak, why is it important to detect a source? Because if the source persists, then we may have repeated outbreaks. COVID may come down and stop altogether. We never know. We're looking for those golden days when there is no COVID. But if it is an infection which is hidden, harbored, and inside the oxygen supply chains and blah blah blah, in all these, if the supply chain is contaminated, if there is a source, then we may see repeated mucor outbreaks in the future for several months or years to come even. And we don't want to have mucor outbreaks because we know how deadly this disease is. We know that the mortality rate is between 50 to 80%. You may come out of COVID but not out of mucor, which is a very sad thing to happen. So when you're dealing with outbreaks, so this graph effectively shows how the outbreak progresses, how the outbreak can recur. You see these bars, there is a progression, there is a regression, and there is a recurrence. Like we see in COVID, waves. So we can see mucor waves even coming in the near future. So we have to identify an outbreak, investigate an outbreak, describe the outbreak, suggest and test a hypothesis. Have a hypothesis. It may be right, it may be wrong. We are not here to sit on judgment, but when lives are being lost, please look at a hypothesis. No, nothing is above an investigation. Control measures have to be put up and followed up, and there has to be constant communication between different players. Here I would say patients, the community, hospital management, hospital staff, and the executive, which is the government of the day. We would like to put forward our recommendation. We, as an I, take up this responsible part of my team at Bangalore Skull Base Institute, Bangalore ENT Institute, and Bangalore Cochlear Implant Institute, Adya Healthcare, Kishore Chandra Foundation. So, representing these entities, I would like to put forward some of the recommendations that we have come up with, when we went through this saga of, I would say, investigations that have lasted close to 3 weeks now. First thing is to break the chain. Unsterile techniques, patient factors, contamination. All these things have to be dealt with individually, and we need to break the chain somewhere. Okay? So, how do we do it? There are patient responsibilities. Now, every one of those patients who have had COVID, especially those who have also had or have diabetes, have to have a high index of suspicion for mucor. I told you the last patient that I got who consulted me was somebody who had COVID 1 year back and who's now developed a black patch on the palate. Now, high index of suspicion, alertness for mucosal signs and symptoms, especially in COVID or post-COVID cases, or even non-COVID cases. Report to an ENT surgeon first. They are the first, I would say, subspecialty to be dealing with these infections, because of the fact that most of the cases are ROCM, rhino, oculo, cerebral, mucormycosis, pulmonologist, infectious control disease specialist, physician, dentist, maxillofacial surgeons, within minutes, not even hours. Whenever I get a call, from a patient with a suspected COVID mucor case, I tell them to rush down. That's because spread can occur from the nose and sinuses, from the palate into the eyes, and thereby into the brain within, I've seen, as less as 2 days. 2 days is all that it took to, and it surprised a lot of us. We have never seen such huge numbers of mucus. We have never seen such rapid progression, such aggressive mucus all our lives, and we are people in this business. Not wasting time is of paramount importance. This is the fundamental message I would like to give the public who are watching or seeing this particular video. Do not panic. If you have a very small patch, if you are in the early phase, and that's why I keep stressing on the fact that you need to reach out to the doctor quickly. You don't need to worry. The prognosis is very good. It's only when the eye is involved, the brain is involved, that the prognosis gets poor, and that's the point where it gets a little out of the hand for all of us. Remember that surgery is essential in most cases. I told you that mucor has necrotic and non-necrotic areas, decaying areas, non-decaying areas. Only surgery can take out the decaying areas. The fungal drugs do not penetrate these areas, and if you leave behind the necrotic areas, as I've told you in one of my previous slides, these infections can come back in the future because the spores can stay there, hibernate, and cause a infection anytime in the future. So when somebody has had a mucor infection, that person has to probably worry about it all his life. So you don't want a part of the fungus, dead or alive, to be lying down in some nook and corner of your sinuses. Surgery is mandatory whenever there are necrotic debris that needs to be cleared. Avoid self-medication. Steroids, antibiotics are not to be taken by the patients. They need to be prescribed and given by the doctors who are treating you. If you've had mucor, you've been treated for mucor, recovered from mucor, go back home, go back to your workplace and see if there is any source of fungi. And report them to the authorities. Now, there are community responsibilities. What are community responsibilities? As a part of the community that we live in, it is very important that masks are used, but they're also used in a proper way. Do not use the masks for long period of time, especially if you're using double masks. Make sure your masks are bought from reputed sources, and make sure that cloth masks are cleaned routinely. Again, avoid self-medication, steroids, antibiotics. Avoid steam inhalation. I've dwelt about this in detail, and I've told you all the reasons why steam inhalation is contraindicated in mucor, in this phenomenon where we see a lot of mucor cases. If you're using oxygen concentrators, sterilize them regularly. Use sterile water. Do not use tap water. Sanitize your air conditionings. Sanitize your AC vents, and avoid plants as much as possible at home. Get rid of your waste regularly and effectively, and follow general sanitization protocols like using hand sanitizers 1,000,000 times in a day. I strongly urge all of you to keep washing your hands, use hand sanitizers all the time. Hospital and institutional responsibilities. It's the onus is on the hospital to check a hypothesis, determine if there's a contamination source, and to check the oxygen and air supply chain, especially because of the critical situation where we are in, and wherein oxygen is coming in from all kinds of new sources. If there is any contamination, zero in upon it, get an infection control team to work on it, and sterilize and eliminate the source. Educate your own staff. Tell your nurses not to use tap water in the humidifiers. Do not use methylene blue and all these kind of things. Make sure that cannulas, nasal cannulas, face masks are all cleaned properly, and even when they're used for the same patient, they need to be cleaned regularly. And all hospitals today must have mucor cells. We have gone beyond the point when it in this outburst of mucor, and it's imperative that every hospital educates their own staff as well as educate the public about mucor cells. I know that in my own institutions, the nursing staff, and many non-teaching staff are not educated about mucor. They know nothing about what's happening out there, and this is true even for some of the medical staff. So that's not a good thing. We need to make sure the hospital educates their own teams as well as the public. Executive responsibilities. What must the government of the day do? First, declare mucormycosis an epidemic. If 10,000 cases in a few months is not an epidemic, what else is? It's been made a notifiable disease. Has it been declared an epidemic? We don't know. We have to make sure it is done on top priority, so that then the protocols set in. Then the hospitals are then mandated to look for sources, and then the education campaigns come in, awareness campaigns set in. Report to international agencies, get information from them, get protocols, SOPs from countries which have SOPs for them and who have handled outbreaks like this in the past. Maintain a national database updatable on a regular basis. Constant information on mucormycosis is a need of the hour. It has to be done on top priority. We found out that we have 10,000 cases only when this became a notifiable disease and all the hospitals started accumulating data. Just about a week back, I did not know. We knew that each broadly, we had people coming on TV saying that there are about 500 cases in different states. But today we know that there are documented 8,800 cases, which means that happened only when the government started, made this a notifiable disease. Immediately we got the numbers, 8,800 cases. That's huge. And those are reported cases. There are several smaller hospitals that probably are not reporting cases, or, I'm sure if 8,800 is what is reported today, there are at least 15,000 cases out there. So, postulate and again investigate possible sources of mucor. The onus is again on the government. See if your SOPs are being followed. The new oxygen manufacturing units, are they sterile? Are they bringing in oxygen in the right way? Hospitals, monitor hospitals, bear upon the hospitals to check upon the supply chains. The PPE and mask manufacturing units, make sure that they are producing these items in the most sterile of circumstances. So, and make sure that they follow SOPs. And then it's very important today that the government of the day ensures that adequate supply of drugs are available for mucor. There are no drugs for mucor at this point of time. Liposomal amphotericin B is in short supply. We do not have it for the next few days. Most of the hospitals are, do not have the most essential of drugs used that is necessary for mucor. That also leads to high mortality rate. So make sure that on top priority, just like how you worked on the oxygen supply chains, now work on getting drugs for mucor, and then make this a public awareness campaign. Get your media channels to and your media outreach to talk about mucor, educate the mucor as much as we've been doing about COVID. This is a dire emergency. We need people to know about what's happening, and it's very important that the government has a top-down approach towards dealing with mucor and all the recommendations that we have proposed for containing this epidemic. So from less than 100 cases a year, mucor has grown to over 10,000 cases in just about a few months. Diabetes, COVID, and immunosuppressions are a concoction for disaster. However, if we ignore source-based inspection, it will be at our own peril. Somebody has to get down and see if there is a contaminated source. Unless this is tackled on a war footing and coordinatedly between states and between central and the state governments, we will have a prolonged epidemic. As I told you, COVID may wane down, but mucor, and many such funguses which are there which can colonize the oxygen supply chains, the gaseous supply chains, they can throw up repeated mucor epidemics, for several months or years to come even. And due to which more people will be affected by mucor over a long period of time, probably long after COVID is gone. This is a clear and present danger. So with this information, I'd like you to write back to me, communicate with our team, and reach out to us if you have more information. We are constantly updating ourselves, and we're constantly reaching out to the authorities, and we're constantly putting our points across. We are using all platforms to reach out to the public and create awareness about mucor. Please be careful, stay safe, stay calm, but make sure that taking all the information that you've heard from this presentation to stay away from mucor, and also help in controlling this particular epidemic. Thank you so much for your patient hearing. It's been a long presentation. Thank you for being along all this while. Thank you.